Welcome to the WBB-TSG Virtual Roundtable on Strengthening Indo-Pacific Partnerships through the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. My name is Christian Pfeiffer with the WBB-TSG team. A few quick items before we begin. Your microphones are automatically muted if you're in the audience. Additionally, your videos are automatically turned off, so you will not accidentally be seen or heard by anybody else throughout the event. If you'd like to submit a question, please open your GoToWebinar control panel. It should be typically on the right side of your screen. And at the bottom is a spot to submit questions to panelists. Type your questions in the box, you hit submit, and our moderator will receive it. And then he'll pass it to the appropriate panelists. If we do not respond to your questions live, just keep in mind we will follow up with each of you following the event and hopefully give you the answer you need. Thanks for being here, and without further ado, let's hear from WBB's CEO, Mr. Robert Olson.
I'd like to say good evening to those joining us from the United States and good morning to everyone west of the international date line. I'm Robert Olson, CEO of Whitney, Bradley & Brown. I'm excited to welcome you to the first of what will be several webinars hosted by the team of WBB and the Stevenson Group. We've designed these webinars to identify and develop sustainable solutions toward a common goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Although we recognize the many challenges ahead in realizing this goal, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the importance of partnerships as they are critical to success. During the webinar, you'll note references to U.S. Indo-PACOM and the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, specifically to strengthening partners and allies as a key component of U.S. national power. Great partnerships are built through strong relationships and trust, something the WBB and TSG team has developed. So let's talk about what you're going to see today. Our team has closely followed the development of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, whose success requires partnerships that are also built on strong relationships and trust, as I talked about before. The WBB TSG team hosting this webinar brings enterprise-level, functional area expertise and an extensive regional network of experience facilitating common-sense, actionable solutions for the Indo-Pacific. Our team has a reputation of delivering decision-quality solution to senior leaders, something we'll continue as we examine the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. We want to share that with you today and perhaps in the future. Now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Stephen McGann, moderator for today's panel. Ambassador McGann is a senior Foreign Service officer, the founder of the Stevenson Group. He has served as ambassador to Fiji, Nauru, Kiribati, Tonga, and Tuvalu. He has served as a Deputy Commandant and International Affairs Advisor to the Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy at the National Defense University. He's currently a board member of the Board of Trustees at Claremont McKenna College and an affiliate of the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. He's a distinguished regional thought leader, able to see across the defense and security sectors to implement sustainable whole-of-nation solutions. As you can see, he's uniquely qualified to moderate this discussion. With that, I'll turn things over to Ambassador Stephen McGann. Sir, over to you.
I'd like to thank Robert Olson for those welcoming remarks. I must say that he was much too kind in his description of me, because WBB and TSG began discussions in 2019 as we started to look at ways in which how the private sector could fill that gap between military, government, and the private sector in assisting Indo-PACOM meet its objectives. At that time, we did not have the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. But today, we are here with the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, which was the most significant bipartisan congressional legislation of this decade. It was significant because it recognizes that in order for the United States and its partners in the Pacific, we can only prevail against our challengers and adversaries with a robust strategy that meets our regional national security concerns with the human security concerns of the people of the Pacific. As Robert mentioned, we hope this will be the first of a series of webinars. But these webinars aren't just high-level discussions. We see these webinars as a tool for commanders, policymakers, government officials, private sector leaders, and non-governmental organizations that will collectively implement the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. So we're not going to have a discussion today at the 40,000-foot level. We're going to focus on the how of the PDI and not the why. And in doing that, we brought together an extremely distinguished panel to discuss all of these issues in a way that focuses primarily on how to get the job done in the Pacific. You read their bios, I'm sure, on the announcement. So I'll just briefly say that I'm pleased to have Dr. Alfred Ohlers, professor at the Asian Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, Dr. Tara Kabutalaka, a professor at the University of Hawaii and the director of the Center for Pacific Island Studies, Dr. Alan Tidwell, director of the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. And although he's not a doctor, we have Ambassador Mark Wall, a distinguished career Foreign Service officer who spent much of his career in the East Asian Pacific region, as well as Africa. And most importantly, for our concerns, he was the political advisor to the commander of US PACOM as one of his final assignments in the Foreign Service. Our format tonight is going to be very simple. I'm going to lead our discussion by asking each of the panelists a question to give us a deeper dive into the priorities and programs needed to implement the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And with that, I'd like to start with Dr. Ohlers. Dr. Ohlers, let me ask you very simply, how can the Pacific Deterrence Initiative effectively mobilize the private sector as a key partner in addressing development issues of concern in the Pacific, particularly those affecting Pacific Island countries that focus on climate resilience, digitalization, and immigration? Three areas that there are shortcomings amongst Pacific Island countries, but necessary if they're going to be full partners in this initiative.
Good afternoon, Ambassador, and to colleagues on the panel, and ladies and gentlemen from around the world who are joining us for this session here. Thank you for that question. It really gets to the heart of the matter. It speaks to both the significance, but also the relevance of PDI as a tool of engagement for the United States, but also in service to the private sector, which is the real locomotive of the economy, and also our Pacific Island partners as well too. And it'll be a great disservice and lost opportunity if we were to miss that opportunity to harness the full potential of PDI in brokering and advancing those relationships and addressing the concerns that are at hand. I will try to keep this brief and at an overview level, and perhaps during Q&A we can do a much deeper dive into specifically the areas that were identified here. What do I think we can do to harness the full potential of PDI and to make it more effective? I think fundamentally we need to raise the value proposition of PDI. The value proposition of PDI in a commercial sense to the private sector, and the value proposition of PDI as a contributor to security, stability, and prosperity to the Pacific Island nations. In short, increasing the resilience of our Pacific Island partners. Now, the reason why I say this is because typically when we have a Department of Defense funded project such as this, significant as it is usually constrained by a number of things. Firstly, it's constrained by time horizons, the authorities, funding authorities in particular. And secondly, it's also constrained in the sense of being broken up into a number of discrete projects that sometimes are not really always connected to each other, but even worse still, are not fully connected to broader efforts of the United States interagency in trying to advance US interests in the region. Now, why is this important? Take a look at this from a point of view of a private sector player. You would only really be interested in getting into PDI if you had very specific capabilities to contribute to parcelize parts of PDI that you could get your hands on. By its very nature, therefore, in the way that PDI is likely to be set up, we're talking about a commercial appeal here that is only going to resonate with a narrow range of private sector players out there. So from the get-go, we're dealing with a much smaller range of private sector players who would be able to contribute to PDI. The appeal is not going to be expansive. The other important thing to bear in mind is, the way that things are set up for PDI, and again, speaking of the typical way Defense Department projects are handled, there is little opportunity for PDI to be harnessed as a seeding or a brokering role to connect up with wider efforts that are going out there in the region, and therefore increase the value of PDI. Now, it may be the case that core projects and funding in PDI will be directed to very specific objectives and projects. But if we were to combine that with other things that were going on, if we were to combine that with particularly upstream and downstream linkages across a supply chain of activities that are associated with the core project funding of PDI, we immediately create a far more appealing commercial proposition that might draw in a wider circle of private sector players. It's also the case, and here I turn to a discussion of PDI linkages to local opportunities, challenges, and priorities. It's also very often the case that military projects tend not to be very closely connected with local economies. They're almost standalone projects that take place entirely reliant on the generation of independent and autonomous capabilities in different contexts, as opposed to deep embeddedment, nesting within local economies, and also connected to local priorities and challenges. I think there's a great opportunity here as well, too, to rethink the way we look at PDI as a locomotive that can be connected up to local concerns and opportunities, and serving as that driver to push ahead to strengthen a broad range of needs, capacities, resiliencies that are needed to be bolstered in the Pacific Islands. So what I'm saying here, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell is, I think that with PDI, we have the opportunity to get to 3 wins here. And in speaking of wins, I know I probably am reading far too many speeches from the PRC, but it's not just win-win. We got win, win, and win. We win on deterrence. We win on expanding private sector involvement by increasing the value of the proposition. And we win also in terms of addressing the security concerns of our Pacific Island partners, improving their resiliency by connecting PDI to both upstream and downstream opportunities in Pacific Island contexts, which will help bolster their resiliency. And with that, Ambassador, I'll stop there and yield the floor to my colleagues. Over.
Well, thank you for that, Al, because it's very important for us to emphasize that in implementation of the PDI, if we go directly to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, and in that section 1251, it makes it very clear that if we're going to build new platforms in the Pacific, then we must also make sure that the host countries for those platforms will have sustainable economic development and the capacity to make sure that the long-term commitment of the United States and its allies in its regions can be achieved. And it's not just in Section 1251 of the NDAA, but if we look at the pending Blue Pacific Act, which ties closely the civilian agencies of the United States government, the United States Coast Guard, and has a clear message that these key areas to make sure that we work to end vulnerabilities in the Pacific are met, because it's those vulnerabilities that are exploited by our competitors and our adversaries. And with that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Katalaka, because it's very important that we begin an understanding of implementation of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative by focusing on the role and contribution of Pacific voices. And so there are two areas in which we can look at that. First, from the structural standpoint, what advice, Tara, would you give to Indo-PACOM to strengthen the diverse architecture that it needs in the maritime domain, land, air, cyber, other aspects of regional security that incorporates also the priorities of the people of the region?
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, thank you, Ambassador, and thanks for having me on the panel, and greetings to all the listeners out there. I'll be very brief, and as you mentioned, I think the views of Pacific Island places or Pacific Island people is very important in this discussion. And maritime is an important aspect of Pacific security for a number of reasons that we are familiar with. Things like the smuggling of people and illegal drugs across the Pacific Islands, as well as Pacific region as a pathway in trade between the Americas and Asia, between China and other parts of the world. And so maritime security is really, really important. The US has, has contributed to maritime security in the region. A lot of its focus is in the North Pacific, and perhaps, expanding that to the rest of the Pacific would also be important. I know that Australia provides assistance to particularly the South Pacific countries, but also to the Northern Pacific countries. And Indo-PACOM plays an important role in terms of the resources that it has and the mechanisms provided by the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to be able to engage more in these things. And a number of things why this is important. One is the maritime space for Pacific is important as an economic resource, not just a strategic space. Fisheries becomes really, really important, and we know the engagement of other countries in the fisheries industry in the Pacific Islands. So surveillance on fisheries, surveillance on security is important. And the potential in the future for things like deep sea mining would then raise a whole lot of new focus as well. So, those are things that perhaps Indo-PACOM and the resources that it has could become much more engaged with Pacific Island countries and governments. I'll stop here now.
Thank you for that. Engaging Pacific Island countries is something that is of key importance, but how we engage them is equally as important. The PDI has at its fundamental goal building a new infrastructure in the region. But in order to build that infrastructure, it has to work within the frameworks that are also established by Pacific Island countries and our regional partners. Alan, I was wondering if you could address how the infrastructure, or rather frameworks for multilateral organizations work in the Pacific, and particularly how they have been affected by the recent split within the Pacific Island Forum, and at the same time, the strengths that we find in other organizations of the Pacific Island countries, such as the Pacific Community known as the SPC, the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and also the Pacific Island Development Forum, just to name 4 key regional organizations. Alan, could you give us an idea of how that can work for Indo-PACOM?
Sure, thanks very much. Steve, let me touch on the intersection of the PDI with the multilateral architecture. And perhaps an important place to start is just to mention that the Pacific Island Forum is the peak political multilateral forum in the Pacific. And of course, it was very much in the news just in February when the election of the new Secretary General met the front lines of a number of newspapers, not only in the Pacific and in the region, but internationally more broadly as well. And there was a split in the Pacific Island Forum that saw 5 Micronesian states effectively either threaten to leave or begin the process of leaving the Pacific Island Forum. And there was much concern expressed that this was somehow the end of multilateral institutions and regionalism in the Pacific. And of course, that would be really far beyond the truth. It's a disappointing outcome, but it's certainly not the end of Pacific regionalism. So, there is a dispute underway in the Pacific Island Forum, but at the same time, the forum did in 2018, through the Boyd Declaration, hold up climate change as being the central concern of the Pacific Island states. And so this is the existential threat that stands before the Pacific Island states. And so thinking about the PDI and a place in which it can intersect with the Pacific Islands, it's certainly through the lens of climate change adaptation. And I think that there's ample space there for government agencies, defense, and others to play a helpful role. And so I think that would be a place where one might want to focus. But thinking about some of the other regional entities, so you mentioned the SBC. So the SBC, what's interesting about it is that it's not the titular political body, but it in fact is the body that delivers effectively, I would say, on the ground development work. It's not so much the body of distributing funds at the political level, but it's doing the research and it's doing the applied work in the Pacific Island communities that really deliver results for people on the ground. And so that is a very practical point of focus for the PDI. It's a very practical point of focus for private sector work. I mean, it is a place where I think many ought to be thinking. And then, the other bodies that you mentioned, like the Melanesian Spearhead Group, for instance, these are other opportunities to have conversations, to do some problem solving, to do some problem identification. And I think this goes to what I think is one of the most fundamental things that these bodies provide those driving the PDI from the United States. I mean, they're points of intersection. They're not merely deliverers of projects, but they're also deliverers of interest and of need. And it's important, I think, that dialogue is established with those multilateral bodies in order to better determine what the needs are and to utilize those bodies in that way.
Alan, I think that's a very insightful, and it begins to get to the heart of the challenge that we're going to face in implementing the PDI, because we have to deal with international organizations, multilateral groups that have status within themselves, but no formal relationship with the United States. On the other hand, and let me turn to Ambassador Wall, In the past, we've been able to strengthen partnerships based on our treaty relationships. We have, of course, the Compact of Free Association in the North Pacific. We have still in place the ANZUS Treaty that links Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. We have a separate treaty, of course, with Japan, which doesn't necessarily deal with security within the whole of the Pacific, but it's still a treaty relationship. And we even have a domestic law relationship with Taiwan. But how do we put all of these pieces together, all right, to give some structure to strengthening these partner relationships while working with governments? Ambassador Wall.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador McGann, and thank all of you who are listening. I've been looking forward to this discussion, and I'm already learning a lot. You know, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, its key goal is strengthening alliances and partnerships, and that notion stems from the view that deterrence requires much more than just helping allies and partners defend themselves against external military threats, as important as that is. You know, it also means helping to build capacity to enhance the safety and well-being of their citizens. And that means dealing with threats to human security, you know, like, as we already mentioned, pandemic diseases, rising sea levels, lack of economic opportunity, drug trafficking, illegal fisheries, criminal gangs, terrorism, and working with allies and partners to address these challenges, I think, can give reassurance about that the U.S. commitment is enduring and is responsible to their concerns. So the legislation authorizing the PDI talks about building these a network security architecture. You know, it calls specifically for setting up multilateral command and control systems and establishing fusion centers for information sharing and enhancing maritime security. You know, Indo-PACOM is going to have a central role in this aspect of PDI, and it's going to have its work cut out for itself. Admiral Davidson, in some testimony he gave in the Senate last March, outlined the really excellent work that Indo-PACOM is already doing to follow through on this. And I think it'd be well worth exploring how these efforts can be ramped up to enable Indo-PACOM to advance the PDI's goals with our allies and partners even more effectively. Just a few examples. Fiji is now co-hosting the annual, the upcoming annual or the conference for the Chiefs of Defense. Might there be other opportunities for hosting conferences on specific issues with regional defense officials and security experts, especially with those from the Pacific Islands? This would enable Indo-PACOM to take advantage of its special convening powers as a host. We have defense attaches in place in Fiji. Would it be possible to expand the program to some of the other Pacific Islands that do have militaries? Joint training exercises and National Guard relationships are especially valuable ways of enhancing relationships. And it'd be well worth looking at how to work even more effectively with the State Department in bolstering security cooperation programs like foreign military financing and IMET and the Global Peace Operations Initiative. And I think a great vehicle for getting started on this is kind of what we're doing now, having more webinars like we're doing now. We can get the word out about the commitment to supporting allies and partners throughout the region. These webinars can be staged very quickly. They can reach key audiences in government, private sector, non-government organizations, education, communication, and other sectors. And they can be organized to be targeted to the concerns. So the first ones could focus on themes mentioned in the NDAA legislation, the security architecture, resiliency, maritime security, countering transnational threats. Others that could follow would look at issues involving climate change mitigation, migration, disaster preparedness, private sector development, public health systems, and other topics depending on the interest. So I've kind of focused what I've had to say on the security dimension of it, but I do see this as part of a much broader whole of government or whole of nation strategy. But perhaps we'll have some time to talk more about that later.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. And this gets us back to some of the points that I like to raise with Dr. Ohlers, because when we talk about the Pacific, and mind you, we started this conversation talking about Pacific Island countries, but we really have to push out beyond the Pacific Island countries. There's the first, the second, and third island chains of importance. We also have to think in terms of re-engaging Timor-Leste, how our strategy with the Philippines is going to play into all of this. How are we going to strengthen our ties with Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries? However, the focal point is still, how do we address, as allies, the military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region as they relate to China's capabilities? Also understanding that while the Chinese are building their military capabilities, they are continually trying to identify ways in which they can undermine any unified framework of allies and partners through information warfare, other elements of smart power, development assistance. They are using these tools while we are also thinking of other tools. Dr. Ohlers, your thoughts?
Thanks very much, Ambassador. And everything that you said there resonates so much, and it speaks to the challenge that we in the United States faces right now. We not only have to be ready for hostilities if they break out, we also have to face the present challenge of addressing strategic competition short of war. And that is the dilemma that we have, and the challenge that we have in terms of trying to apportion our scarce resources across the Defense Department in addressing these. There's not only a need for immediate readiness, but there's also needs to be investments into the future, looking way over the horizon, because if you're just thinking cyber right now, you're already behind the curve. We're talking about the fusion of cyber, 5G, space, and artificial intelligence into a very, very powerful combination of capabilities that can overwhelm even before the first shot is fired. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to try to find a balance between, and I think PDI provides some of the initial balance there in the sense of creating the deterrence, but a deterrence that I would say to a degree is focused very much on a kinetic sense. It is forward-leaning and postured. It goes a significant way to preserving the technological edge of the United States in the face of the expanding military capabilities of the PRC. It takes us many steps forward as well too in starting to build a theater-wide, I really emphasize this, a theater-wide construct, network of allies and partners and like-minded to address the threat. And it takes us also technologically into a multi-domain context where any kind of conflict is going to be waged. So in a very positive sense, it is pushing us forward in that sense. What is missing currently in PDI, however, to some, and maybe others would argue a significant degree, is this notion of dealing with the fusion of all elements of national power across the dime to include as well paramilitaries and so forth, and their deployments in the pursuit of what I term, and I'm constantly corrected for imprecision, gray zone conflict. The kind of strategic competition that is irregular, that is multifaceted in the sense of involving diplomatic coercion backed up by economic power, that is reinforced by the arrival of paramilitary fishing fleets, that is also accompanied by a massive misinformation and disinformation campaign to turn domestic constituencies, to turn the tide of opinion against those who may resist. Now, authoritarian countries have the advantage of being able to marshal all these elements of national power in the pursuit of those objectives. We in the United States, however, we pride ourselves on democracy and freedom and the separation of powers and so forth. But yet, we have to try to find a way to work through this. And I hate to sound like an old record player, but it comes back again, to the resilience of those networks and relationships that we have, and how we can work closer together with like-minded nations in the preservation of fundamental tenets of the international order, the rules-based order in particular, but commitments to democracy, transparency, and openness among ourselves, in setting a bar higher than what the PRC is getting to. There is a lot that we have not fully exploited on the cooperative front in dealing with gray zone and irregular warfare challenges. We're only just starting to scratch the surface, for example, in getting coordinated in information campaigns. But there's so much that we need to work on together in terms of the cyber domain, harmonization of laws, common perceptions of threats, unified cooperative approaches addressing cyber challenges and so forth. And let alone, let's get out on the water and talk about 200 ship fishing fleets and things like that. Take the incident around the Galapagos Islands recently. And, that was an eye-opener. What would we do if in the Pacific, a fleet like that showed up? Because such a fleet did show up in Filipino territorial waters as, again, an element of salami slicing and precedent setting. But what if it happened off the Solomon Islands or off Fiji? And how are we going to respond to contingencies such as those? Over.
Al, thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Alan Tidwell, because Dr. Ola just brought up a very important point, that our adversaries are also prepared to exploit economic vulnerabilities amongst partner countries. We're in a situation where two of our most reliable allies in the region, Australia and New Zealand, have different approaches and economic ties to our competition, particularly China. How can we make sure that the economic strengths that our relationships bring to the region, particularly, again, once more, our private sector engagements amongst our countries, how can that be brought to bear to ensure that we still have a comprehensive and cohesive approach to dealing with competitors and adversaries in the Pacific?
Thanks for that, Steve. Absolutely. New Zealand and Australia are experiencing different kind of economic challenges with their main trade partner, the PRC. Of course, Australia is receiving numerous trade punishments in the form of sanctions and limitations on trade, while New Zealand is signing a free trade agreement, but is caught in the midst of a international and somewhat domestic tussle over really kind of what its settings are over its relationship with China. But more broadly, thinking about the ways in which the private sector can play a role in I suppose, pushing back against the Chinese investment, the Chinese role in the Pacific, maybe is to think a little bit about what's happened in the infrastructure space around undersea cables and even the development of the electrification project in Papua New Guinea. I mean, it's very clear that the private sector, private interests play a pivotal role in delivering results that bolster a country's resilience, to use a phrase that's been used before, that's been mentioned before. So that we see a Palau cable being developed by Australia, the United States, and Japan. We see the Australians investing in a undersea cable that links Solomon's, Papua New Guinea, and now thinking about Timor-Leste. And we see the electrification of Papua New Guinea beginning to take, build up ahead of steam, and that's a really interesting one. The way in which USAID is actually partnered with electrical commissioners from the United States to think about not only what does electrification really require for Papua New Guinea, but also what's the regulatory framework. And so I think that that's an important component of this public-private partnership, which will see a rollout of electrical facilities in Papua New Guinea over time. I think the target is by 2030, 70% of the country being electrified. And so Australia has played a role in this. I mean, through their Australia Infrastructure Facility, they've nominated a project in Papua New Guinea for electrification. We've got USAID coming in. These are government entities that are partnering with the private sector to push forward some of these infrastructure deals. So, Steve, I think that it's that kind of activity that we would look to, and we would look to companies with the capacity to deliver large infrastructure solutions as really being, an important pushback against some of those interests.
Alan, that's great. As we look at these large-scale solutions and bringing in larger American companies, Australian companies, and New Zealand companies, we cannot forget that the private sector also exists within Pacific Island countries and others within the region. And one of the things that we have to always consider is the fact that, again, we have to build capacity within the Pacific Island countries and others that are going to be hosting these platforms. Now, we just can't build infrastructure inside the fence. We have to build infrastructure outside the fence. And no more important than that is to identify where those needs will be the greatest. And while we've spoken quite often about the North Pacific, we don't talk specifically enough about the South Pacific and Melanesia in particular. We've seen discussions about a joint facility of Papua New Guinea, Australia, and the United States on Manus Island. But again, that's just one example of the importance of the entire Melanesian region. So I was wondering if you could focus on what needs to be done to address issues, not just in Melanesia, but issues that deal with capacity building, right? Making sure that larger infrastructure firms can partner with small Pacific Island country companies, making sure that we understand that skilled labor in the Pacific is also migratory labor. So perhaps you can address those questions.
Ambassador, before I address those questions directly, I just want to raise a couple of things. The first is, I think we all accept the fact that China is here to stay. And therefore the challenge with us, and not only China is here to stay, but a lot of Pacific Island governments have agency in deciding to establish and strengthen relationship with China. And so the question for us, and particularly the US, is how do we manage our relationship with our Indo-Pacific partnership, in this case, Pacific Island partners and allies, in a way that first acknowledges the fact that China is here to stay, and second, ensures the maintenance of rules-based order. And here I mentioned rules-based order not only in terms of the broad discussions that are taking place in trade and cases of South China Sea and so forth, but at the very local level. What does it look like? What does a rules-based order look like in particular places in the Pacific? And so that is really, really important. And the other thing is that, China manifests itself in different forms in the Pacific. There is the Chinese state. There are Chinese corporations, Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese people. And Pacific Islanders encounter these different manifestations of China either on a daily basis or not so regularly. For most Pacific Islanders, they encounter Chinese nearly daily if you live in Honiara or if you live in Port Moresby, in ways that they do not encounter the US or US citizens. And so that's important to consider in discussions of security as well. And which raises the question, and I'll come to your question about partnership in a little while, which raises the question, there are certain things that the US can approach through its military establishments, but there are lots of things that it cannot achieve through that. And Indo-PACOM, so China, another thing is that there is a need for greater understanding of the Pacific Islands region. And here I mean not only understanding the politics, the economics, the geographical space of the Pacific, but a really deep understanding of Pacific Island cultures that will enable establishments such as Indo-PACOM to be able to engage with Pacific Island people in meaningful ways, which means, for instance, understanding Pacific languages. How many people in Indo-PACOM or the State Department speak any of the Pacific languages? Speak Tok Pisin, which would give you access to about 9 million Pacific Islanders, those living in the countries of Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. In the meantime, China, on the other hand, is teaching 7 different Pacific Island languages in China. China has established 7 centers for Pacific Island studies. Its understanding of the Pacific is at the moment very limited, but it's working hard to address that. Now that comes to the role of private sector. So China's presence, or at least what Pacific Islanders see most, is not the Chinese state, but rather Chinese corporations, Chinese businesses. That's what it sees most. Chinese investments in natural resource extractive industries, in the case of Melanesia, forestry, mining, and increasingly, of course, we all know about fisheries. In those investments, there's rarely partnership between Pacific Islanders and Chinese companies. And that's something that the US can do differently. That those investments, as we all know, are usually by Chinese companies, but these Chinese corporations play an important role in the diplomacy between those countries and China. In the case of Solomon Islands, for instance, prior to the switch in September of 2019, a lot of the interactions at the ground level was not with the Chinese state, but with Chinese corporations and leaders who were establishing that relationship. And so partnership is absolutely important. Partnership that generates job opportunities, that contributes to the economies of these specific places, strengthens the relationship.
Thank you for that, Tar, because it gets to a critical point. One of the key elements behind the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is congressional intent. And it was intended that the PDI be implemented quickly, completely, and it presupposed that public-private partnerships would be important to meet this objective. At the same time, we also understand that Indo-PACOM cannot achieve its objectives without assistance from other civilian agencies. Mark, how do we sort of meld this whole of government approach to an understanding of the private sector role in implementing the PDI, and also implementing the PDI with the speed, velocity that Chinese companies use to penetrate the region, and our own whole of government approach is not designed to address that?
Good. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And just picking up briefly on the previous remarks, I do think it's important that the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is defined not just by what is against, but also what is for, not just by concerns about China's role in the region, if you will, but also by the commitment of allies and partners throughout the region in a rules-based order that promotes security, development, and shared values. And I think part of what motivates the PDI is the concern that this is a very important part of what we need to be focusing on in the Pacific region. This is why Admiral Locklear, who I worked for as the PACOM commander 8 or 9 years ago, why he attended the meeting of the Pacific Island Forums along with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I think it reflected even then an understanding that that it was very, very important to bring the Pacific region into our broader Asia Pacific and now Indo-Pacific strategy. But in terms of how we can link up with other government agencies, other international partners, private sector, Washington has a very extensive toolkit that it can use when it gets serious. I've been involved in a number of these initiatives over the years, but we do have a variety of diplomatic and development tools that we can use, as well as military ones. And we also have ways of triggering private sector involvement and working to engage cooperation with foreign governments and international institutions. There's been a bipartisan support in Washington for the PDI. It's really remarkable to see in a otherwise rather divided place. And there's also strong support for the legislation that you mentioned earlier on, Steve, about the Blue Pacific Act. But I think it might be time to consider an even broader, more integrated initiative with the focus on the Pacific and Southeast Asia. In fact, this is sort of a thought experiment, if you will, but if I was the coordinator for Pacific Island affairs in the National Security Council, I could imagine fashioning a new strategy that mobilized these many different resources with the PDI as the centerpiece, backed up by the Blue Pacific Act. And I would consider recommending that we look at options like a a summit of Pacific leaders in Washington. And if it's not possible to do that in person, do it virtually. We've been doing this in other ways with the Quad and in other ways. Similar events could be organized with foreign and defense ministers. In terms of working with civilian agencies on development efforts, ramping up USAID's programs, tasking the Millennium Challenge Corporation to look at potential candidates for its threshold programs, more Peace Corps volunteers, having the new Development Finance Corporation explore ways of jumpstarting private sector capital flows into projects in the region. We also need to be looking at working with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other multilateral lenders in expanding their activities. An international donors conference for the Pacific might be something to consider. More diplomats in the Pacific countries showing up at meetings of the Pacific Islands Forum, as we did back in 2012 at the ministerial level on a regular basis, and working even more closely with our traditional friends and allies in the region, like Australia and New Zealand, while also looking at ways to cooperate more with others with similar interests, like Japan, like India, maybe like Taiwan. Perhaps the Quad has a role to play in this. And finally, I think we should be exploring ways to promote international trade. Perhaps a special trade preferences zone along the lines of the AGOA, the African Growth and Economic or Growth and Opportunity Act, might be relevant. Perhaps even a U.S. Pacific free trade area. I mean, there are all kinds of options that are worth looking at. And I could go on, but I hope that kind of gives you a flavor of ways to reinforce not only the security focused tools, but also using diplomatic, trade, and development tools at our disposal. And if we really want to get serious about reaffirming our relationships in the region, as we are doing now with the PDI, I think there are many other ways we can also that we can bring to bear to do that.
Mark, I think those are all good ideas. I would slightly alter your suggestion and look to having that summit in Honolulu, because one of the things we have to continue to do is to reinforce the reality that the United States is a Pacific country, and somehow holding it in Washington seems too distant. But at the same time, as we become much more aggressive in the region, and I'll use that term, we have to make sure that we don't seem to dispossess our allies, particularly Australia and New Zealand, who have been engaged in the region, that we don't turn off our Pacific Island country partners who do not see this as a policy for them as much as it is a policy against China. How do we address those types of issues, Alan, to make sure that this can work?
So, effectively, the question is how do you work for our allies rather than, I suppose, through our allies? Maybe that's a nice way to put it. And so, the way to do that, I think, is to ensure that one engages at a deep level. So you could think about here's a range of ideas. You could think about with the Osmond process of actually creating an Osmond Secretariat that helps deepen that relationship on an ongoing sort of basis. One could think about deepening our relationship with New Zealand as well, and maybe setting up their own ministerial set of meetings with New Zealand. Or, here's a revolutionary idea. We could renew our obligations under ANZUS, but maybe that's too far. But so those would be things that might help deepen our relationship with those two very large countries, but with the range of smaller Pacific Island countries. I think part of it is developing an ongoing relationship, showing up, being present, and engaging in dialogue. And I think it's that dialogue that is so critically important. And so, one of the things that I was just thinking about when Mark was doing his pitch, and there was some great ideas in there, I thought, what about secondments? What about taking U.S. personnel and seconding them as to governments around the Pacific, with the idea about using those secondments as a way of helping to do some skill transfer, to get a better idea of the challenges that those folks face as they govern their countries, and utilizing our human resource capacity in these secondments as a way of bolstering those connections, because those secondments also develop relationships, and those become meaningful relationships that link Washington, link Honolulu with the capitals throughout the Pacific. And I could also imagine, just as another idea, is also encouraging the Pacific to help deepen their connections here in Washington. I was really struck by some dialogue that we had with Dame Meg Taylor as she was getting ready to leave her role as Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. And it became very clear to me as she began talking about her relationships with Washington, was that there was an information deficit. And that if an information deficit can be addressed by establishing relationships, why not actually encourage or even support the PIF sending an observer here to Washington? How about a secondment to the PIF in Suva? I mean, these are ideas that would help bolster those relationships. The Australians have used secondments throughout the Pacific in different settings. And, we can learn a little bit from what they've done right and what they've done wrong. And I know that Tara has some views on that. But these might be some ideas to help build those relationships. And then you can think about also the idea of some track 2 diplomacy, some track 2 relationships, where one can get sub-national leaders or at least influential folks from these Pacific Island states, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, together to talk about common challenges, talk about common perceptions. If one works it, one can do a good job, but you've got to work it. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the things that we have to always focus on in the region is to recover from mistakes that have been made. For example, we allow Tonga, one of our strongest Pacific countries that do not have a treaty with the United States, but yet Tonga was in Iraq with us. Tonga was in Afghanistan with us. But today, Tonga is $125 million in debt to China. Vanuatu, the Millennium Challenge Corporation of the United States built a $60 million ring road around the island of Vanuatu. Yet today, we constantly hear stories of Chinese inroads in Vanuatu and beating back stories about their potentially having a presence based on a maritime presence in Vanuatu. And just recently, we saw Kiribati switch yet again its relations between Beijing and Taipei. Tara, what can we do to overcome these past mistakes to make sure that Pacific Island countries are incorporated into the PDI?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think some of the things have already been mentioned in terms of more partnership with these places. And talking about the South Pacific in particular, not necessarily the Northern Pacific, in the past decade, in fact, more than the past decade, maybe 2 decades, the US has been relatively absent in a lot of these places. Yes, there were US presence through things like the Millennium Development Challenge and therefore assistance to places like Vanuatu, but by and large, they were absent, both in terms of their participation or contributions to economic development, as well as in terms of political representation. You find, as you know very well, Ambassador, that our ambassadors and embassies are in the bigger countries like Fiji or Papua New Guinea, but absent in a lot of the smaller Pacific Island countries, which are smaller in size, but huge in terms of EEZ, and therefore very important as well. And so greater engagement. And talking about contributions to economic development, a lot of these places would probably, relatively smaller amount of money can make a big difference in terms of contribution to economic development. And that's very important. I want to go back to something that Alan was talking about earlier on in terms of how do we engage and the mechanisms that are in place. So we've talked about the crop agencies, and Ambassador, you mentioned Honolulu. And I wanted to raise the issue of the Pacific Islands Development Program within the East-West Center, which is an organization that is in place that has in the past been a segue through which the US has interactions with Pacific Island leaders. Yes, there are currently issues with PIDP getting back onto being a crop agency, and that's something that can be worked out. And so re-looking at the role of the Pacific Islands Development Program, I know that the East-West Center is going through a lot of organizational change at the moment. And this provides an opportunity for the PDI to channel some of its energies and resources through an organization that's funded for by the US government that has connections to the Pacific. And within PIDP, in terms of private sector involvement, there is something called the Joint Commercial Commission, which exists or has, since I've known it, exists as an umbrella for facilitating private sector, Pacific Island private sector relationships with the US. Maybe revisiting that and see how it can be used in the current circumstances that we have.
I think that's right. And another area that we've forgotten has been the importance of humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Those of us who have spent quite some time working with APCSS know that that is a key area of focus. And if we're going to address infrastructure development within the Pacific, HADR has to be a component of that. Al, do you want to expand upon that a little bit more?
Absolutely, Ambassador. And, it goes back to that old saying, right? A dollar spent in prevention is worth multiple in terms of preparation and deeper resilience. So yes, it goes all the way to how do we climate proof, I think. Many of our Pacific Island partners there who are faced with existential threats. And, we normally kind of focus on the headline grabbing things such as, inundation by rising tides and things like that. Definitely, but I can tell you that depopulation and that challenge of existing in the Pacific comes even before that, in the sense of changes in climate patterns, migratory fish stocks responding to temperature changes in the ocean, and perhaps most critical of all, salination of water lenses and, the destruction of agriculture and life support systems, essentially, in many of our Pacific partners. So that is one fundamental area that really has to be addressed. And some of the capacities to assist and to address them definitely exist within the US government, but there are also multiple commercial outfits out there that have this kind of expertise from the tracking of climate change through to prediction, through to, thickening the webs of resilience in different pieces of critical infrastructure, right through to water management and so forth. The opportunities are replete. They're everywhere for the private sector to play roles, and in partnership with the public sector. And it's not only the US that's got to be a player, it could be many other countries that could be contributing to this, like-minded countries as well too. I put out there the example of Taiwan, itself an island, itself an expert in small-scale agriculture, itself also expert in agriculture in high salt environments, because of just what it is. There's so much expertise that we can leverage across the public, the private, and also the international spectrum to build up ways of addressing this. And we haven't even got to the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff yet, where there are also things that we could take a look at in terms of responding to disasters in a more coherent and cooperative way across a range of partners. We could also explore areas to do with pre-positioning of emergency supplies and the development of hubs, whether these are maritime hubs or airborne airfields and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen under PDI that is going to be of dual purpose nature. And we can harness these airfields, port facilities, transportation sort of capabilities and so forth. We can harness all this to build that climate resiliency, to build that capability to look disasters in the eye and get over the disasters in a far quicker fashion and bounce back from those nasty episodes. Over.
I think those are all excellent thoughts. And I think it's also important that you brought to this conversation that Taiwan does have legitimate concerns in the Pacific, that we can look to resources on Taiwan in developing post-pandemic strategies for rebuilding healthcare infrastructure, looking at ways to deal with NCDs, non-communicable diseases. So there's a whole range of areas that we can tap into that our partners in the Pacific can address. And along with that, it still goes back to one question. How can, and I'll address this to you, Ambassador Wall, how can the US government civilian agencies do more to help promote public-private partnerships, not just between large companies from the United States and Australia, New Zealand, and others, but also public-private partnerships in the smaller countries that are going to be affected by the PDI?
Right. Well, I think I mentioned one tool that we have, that Washington has in its toolkit that can be very helpful in this way, and that is the Development Finance Corporation. It emerged out of the old Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which was there to provide insurance to encourage investment in other countries, and also to jumpstart the flow of private capital. The Development Finance Corporation has got a lot of ways it can do that. Some lending authority on its own. It can provide support for feasibility studies to kind of pave the way for private investment in worthwhile projects. But beyond that, the World Bank has an arm called the International Finance Corporation, which is set up to do very much the similar things. So this is a way to use public seed capital to kind of get the private sector more engaged in these projects. But beyond what can be done directly, steps to improve the investment climate, kind of policy changes, structural changes in countries can can also be very, very helpful in spurring private sector involvement and public-private sector partnerships. And their USAID and the World Bank, they've played roles in this respect in many countries around the world, and they have a lot of experience how countries themselves can improve their own climates for investment. But just to pick up on some of the other points that were made, I think more dialogue and more secondments just showing up is very, very important. I mean, the United States has had a secondment from the State Department in Singapore at APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. I mean, we do this sort of thing. So there are ways that we can do more of an outreach effort in the region. But even more broadly, I think there's as we consider these kinds of efforts, and I think the PDI demonstrates this, we're pushing on an open door in Washington. There is such broad support for working more closely, for engaging more closely in the region, and it's not just about competition with China, but I think there's the understanding about the vulnerabilities of the Pacific Islands to transnational challenges. These affect not only their security interests, but U.S. interests as well, and humanitarian interests also. And even more directly, that U.S. interests as a nation are at stake. Because as I realized when I was, and as you pointed out, Steve, already, when I was in Honolulu, I had a big map of the Pacific on my wall at Camp Smith, and I could see not only how vast the Pacific was, but also that the United States was really a part of it. As you indicated, that just showed the extent to which the United States really is a Pacific nation. So this is where we're heading.
And I think that in order for us to get there, and I really want to emphasize the importance of listening to Pacific voices. I recall recently participating in a conversation that Alan and the Center for Australia, New Zealand Pacific Studies coordinated with the president of Palau, Tami Remengesau. And while he welcomed the PDI, he also made it clear that Palau's priorities, for instance, in developing the tourism sector and helping to strengthen local law enforcement capabilities, fisheries protections, were all important issues for him. And Alan, I'd like to kind of expand upon that notion of how do we make sure we understand that as we build this new infrastructure in the Pacific, that Pacific country priorities are taken into account.
Thanks, Steve. Could I also just say that the meeting with the Palau president was co-hosted with FARA Center, the Center for Pacific Island Studies. So it wasn't just me. Look, I think this is a really important point. How do you engage with Pacific voices? How do you get those voices in Washington? How do you get them in Honolulu? And I think that is a tremendous challenge. And it's a challenge in part of just meeting a very large American bureaucracy and a very large American system with bureaucracies and systems that are much different in scale and whose traditions, whose cultures, whose practices sometimes don't meld nicely with the American bureaucratic system. And so it's in part having, I think, an eye towards and some understanding of the kind of environment one is operating in. So, when you think about, for instance, the challenge of tourism in a Pacific Island country, tourism is got a multiplicity of issues that intersect with it. It's not just putting tourists in hotels and touring them around an island, but it also involves, as you mentioned, policing, healthcare, transportation, and these things tax an island tremendously and impact the totality of the island. So engaging in that dialogue, being sensitive to that dialogue, and I think having in one's mindset a word that gets used a lot in the Pacific. We've heard it a couple of times tonight already, and that's this notion of a partnership. And I go back to the words of Governor Radewagen from American Samoa. And his phrase was, "Come, let us build the future in partnership." And I think that essence of partnership is tremendously important in the Pacific. And so it's having that cultural sensitivity, that frame of mind, as we do a whole of government, a whole of nation engagement with nations that are very small, who have different cultural practices and different sensitivities. And it's trying to meld those two together. And Steve, I think that's the answer I'm going to give you. So over to you.
Well, that's a good answer. And one of the things about today's session that demonstrates the global nature of the implementation of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is that a quick perusal of our registrants list has shown participants not only from Pacific Island countries, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Israel. We have been able to reach out beyond a narrow discussion group to a much larger discussion group. And there might be, in the few minutes remaining, an opportunity to look to our chat room to see if there are any questions that may be there.
There are currently 9 questions.
Pardon me?
Bastian, before we do that, can I just throw in a couple of points just to add to what Alan mentioned? I think listening to Pacific Island voices is important. A lot of times, though, we are predominantly listening to government voices, and therefore there is a need to recognize that there are multiplicity of voices within the Pacific, not only government voices, but others as well. In terms of engagement with Pacific Island countries, not only having officials from the Pacific come to DC or the other way around, but scholarships are really, really important. I know I'm biased because I work for a university, but the US South Pacific Scholarship started off with 5 scholarships. Now it's gone down to 3. In the meantime, the number of scholarships for Pacific Island students going to China has increased dramatically. And so looking at those is also important. I just want to throw that in before we open it up for questions.
Okay, we have 2 questions related to Tonga. The first one is, how would Tonga join the Pacific Deterrence Initiative? And then I have a 3-part question. Gentlemen, why don't I let you answer that first question now, and then I'll tee up the second one when you're finished. How would Tonga join the PDI?
I think earlier in our discussion, we did mention that there was a role for Tonga, as in other Pacific Island countries, because if we look at the overall framework of the PDI, it talks about not only humanitarian assistance and disaster response, it talks about logistically pre-positioning supplies on various Pacific Island countries, not just for war fighting, but for HADR. It talks about training opportunities. Many of the countries in the Pacific have remote islands that are underpopulated that can be used for training. There's a number of areas in which countries such as Tonga can participate. I'll throw it open to any other thoughts. Al, I'll look to you. You have a lot of Tongans that come to APCSS.
We do, Ambassador. And the one thing I would add to that list that you just mentioned was the whole notion of building stronger partnership networks, interoperability through the mechanism of education and training, precisely. And, I believe under PDI, there will be much more emphasis on providing opportunities to allies and partners to exchange officers, but more importantly, in the context of Tonga, to enable training of Tongan security personnel in United States professional military, but other security-related training institutions. Over.
Tara, did you have a point you'd like to make about Tonga? Anyone else?
Right.
Mark?
Steve,
Well,
I could come in on that.
Oh, Al, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you don't mind, just very briefly, the interesting thing too about perhaps with Tonga's interest would be to recognize, of course, that it is receiving training from the Nevada National Guard, Papua New Guinea with Wisconsin, Fiji with Nevada as well. And so it makes you wonder if whether or not there's also an opportunity, just building on Al's previous point about training, is whether or not there's also an opportunity to get these three countries together and make that an opportunity for education, training, and exchange of ideas between the three militaries, PNG, Fiji, and Tonga, their National Guard representatives, and Indo-PACOM.
Great.
I was going to say very much the same thing. When I was at PACOM, we met with the Chief of Defense of Tonga at one of the Chief of Defense meetings, and I was in Iraq at the time when Tonga had its own military forces there. So the PDI isn't so much an organization that one joins. I think the PDI is set up to reach out to partners like Tonga. The relationship with the National Guard is one way we're doing this. But I would be very interested in looking at more opportunities for joint training, defense attaches program. And I think PDI will provide a way of promoting that.
Okay. Another point that I'd like to raise before we close is that as we look at developing these new ways to build structures and frameworks in the Pacific Island countries and elsewhere in the region, that we take note of the significant economic impact that this pandemic has had on women and other vulnerable populations whose basically their economic viability has been greatly stunted by the demise of tourism, by the loss of employment in service industries, and in many cases, when we think of the fishing industry, we also have to think of the onshore role that women play in maritime affairs. So part of any capacity building and helping to create strong and sustainable economies in the Pacific have to include a particular eye to trying to address the issues of women and vulnerable populations. Well, we've come to the 90-minute mark. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for being with us tonight. As WBB CEO Robert Olson said, this webinar is the first of a series in which WBB, the Stevenson Group, and other partners in the private sector will see this webinar as an ongoing tool, I'll say once more, for commanders, policymakers, government officials, private sector leaders, and non-governmental organizations to come up with practicable solutions for implementing the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again.